Murder case is solved.
We've utilized an investigative technique that is fairly new in policing, certainly in Canada.
Toronto police have identified the killer of 9-year-old Christine Jessup, a case that resulted in a years-long wrongful conviction and shocked the country. Plus,
I asked, why am I being treated this way? I kid you not, she said, it's because of where you're born.
A moment that stopped this PhD student in his tracks after a border officer allegedly tells him being Somali was a reason for questioning. Now he has a message. And more eyes on aggressive drivers. A new traffic enforcement team plans to crack down on drivers who aren't following the rules, with the goal of reducing the number of serious collisions on Toronto streets. Good evening, I'm Talia Ricci. One of Ontario's most well-known cold cases is solved. The murder of Christine Jessup in 1984 captivated the country. Then came the trial, conviction, and then exoneration of Guy-Paul Morin, one of the young girl's neighbors. Today, police say they have finally identified the real killer. John Lancaster reports.
It was October 3rd, 1984, when 9-year-old Christine Jessup went missing.
Toronto Police Chief James Raymer made the startling announcement this afternoon. 36 years after 9-year-old Christine Jessup vanished from her home in Queensville, north of Toronto, the child's killer has finally been identified, an old family friend named Calvin Hoover.
Calvin Hoover of Toronto, Ontario, was 28 years old in 1984. He was known to the Jessup family at the time of Christine's disappearance.
Yet Hoover was never considered a suspect at the time. Instead, investigators zeroed in on Jessup's neighbor, Guy-Paul Morin. The 24-year-old maintained his innocence but was convicted by so-called jailhouse informants and testimony from an undercover police officer. DNA eventually cleared Morin, and DNA snared the real killer.
We've utilized an investigative technique that is fairly new in policing, certainly in Canada.
Police say crime scene DNA was sent to a lab in the U.S., which helped build genealogical lineages, essentially family trees of individuals who shared similar DNA to the crime scene. Hoover's family was one of them, and he became a person of interest. Another DNA test revealed an old blood sample of Hoover's matched semen from the crime scene. Hoover, though, died in 2015. Reached at home by CBC News, Christine's father, Bob Jessup, said he was sickened by the news. Christine's mother, Janet, told CBC News, "As I get older, you just start wondering when things are going to happen or if it's going to happen. Fortunately, it's happened, but it's still a bit of a shock. Quite a bit of a shock, actually." Police say they refused to let the case go cold.
We're just not going to give up, and somebody is always going to be looking.
John Lancaster, CBC News, Toronto.
And we have reaction tonight from the man who was wrongfully convicted of Jessup's murder. Guy-Paul Morin released a statement saying, "2 members of the Toronto Police Service came to my home and told me they had identified the man who murdered Christine Jessup through DNA. I am relieved for Christine's mother, Janet, and her family, and hope that this will give them some peace of mind. I'm grateful that the Toronto police stayed on the case and have now finally solved it. When DNA exonerated me in January 1995, I was sure that one day DNA would reveal the real killer, and now it has." Reaction is pouring in after this announcement, decades in the making. Our Dahlia Ashry with more now from the town's mayor and those involved in the case.
The closure is so important to everyone.
Closure for the community and the mayor of East Gwillimbury in York Region.
It was just such a tragedy in our community at that time, and without ever having it solved, I think people carried it all the time.
A wave of relief for those involved in the cold case of Christine Jessup as well, including forensic genetic genealogist Anthony Redgrave.
Relieved on behalf of the families, the family of Christine and also of Mr. Morin as well. There are so many people and the entire community, they've all been waiting for answers
Redgrave explains how decades later science and advanced technology helped find those answers. Toronto police have identified the killer as Calvin Hoover.
We passed off a candidate for identification based on our findings, and the law enforcement agency did their due diligence to research that particular ID and confirm it via STR testing, which is what's used on most forensic cases.
The case also had a lasting impact on Guy-Paul Morin, who was wrongfully convicted for years.
The impact of that lasts forever. You're never the same after that kind of stress. So there's nothing you can do about it now, except it's good that it's come out and it's clear to everyone that this is an innocent man.
The question on the minds of many now put to rest.
Almost a calm feel now that finally we have answers.
Dahlia Ashry, CBC News, Toronto.
A York University PhD student is fighting for changes to Canada's border screening policies. It comes after the student was stopped and questioned by officers after a research trip to Kenya. He says he was singled out because of his birthplace and skin color, despite being a Canadian citizen for more than 15 years. Nick Boisvert has the details.
We hear about these stories in our communities. You know, you read about it as a scholar. You never think it's going to happen to you.
More than a year since Mohamed Douale's return to Canada, his experience at his home airport is still gnawing at him.
It really concerned me. How many Canadians who are Black, who are Muslim, who are Somali, are treated this way?
Douale was out of the country here conducting research at Kenya's sprawling refugee camps. Many of the displaced people who live here are Somali refugees. Douale used to be one too. He says his birthplace set off a harrowing encounter with a border agent when he returned home, filled with what Douale calls inappropriate questioning and the unabashed racial profiling of a Canadian citizen.
And I asked, you know, why am I being treated this way? And I kid you not, she said, it's because of where you're born. You're Somalian, right? And I was literally frozen in that moment. I was just, it's a moment of pure astonishment. I never thought, you know, that, you know, the discrimination would be so overt.
That alleged exchange is now the foundation of a human rights complaint against the CBSA. The agency has investigated and says it didn't find any wrongdoing. Experts say that might be true in strictly legal terms.
The law as we see it today is far too broad.
Immigration lawyer Giddy Mammon hears complaints about border agents and their tactics often, but he says clients have few options to fight back.
The law, as it's crafted today, allows an immigration officer at the border to do just about anything to get at the truth as he or she sees it. But I think there needs to be oversight.
The National Council of Canadian Muslims has the same demand. They're representing Douale in his human rights complaint.
And so what we're fighting for right now, in looking for oversight, is not just oversight on paper. We're looking for effective oversight.
The organization says it hears 2 to 3 complaints every month about CBSA screening practices. Nick Boisvert, CBC News, Toronto.
The province reported an additional 783 cases of COVID-19 today, with a notable number of cases in York Region. That region saw a record number of cases today at 127, the Premier calling it concerning. Toronto recorded another 239, Peel had 136, and Ottawa had 89. In the midst of what's being called the largest flu shot campaign in Ontario's history, family doctors say there aren't yet enough shots to go around. Lauren Pelly looks at why.
On this chilly afternoon in North York, family doctor Elisa Naiman is braving the cold to vaccinate her patients.
We've never had so much demand for people calling for flu shots. People have been calling since the beginning of September to get a flu shot.
With 7,000 patients at her clinic, Naiman needs a lot of doses on hand. but she was only sent 500 in the first round. 150 of those were high-dose shots for seniors, and she's already run out.
It's actually been very frustrating.
Same story for this Ottawa physician.
We received 15 doses of the high-dose flu shot, and in our office, I have 1,400 patients in downtown Ottawa, and I have 185 patients who would meet the criteria for the high dose. So that's anybody over the age of 65.
Pharmacies have also reported early supplies drying up, but
there are no shortages.
Provincial officials say more rounds are coming.
The first shipments went to hospitals, to long-term care homes and retirement homes because we wanted to protect those individuals first because they are vulnerable.
The broader public is also hoping to avoid both COVID and the flu. Data shows during the 29 to 2020 flu season, which overlapped with the start of the pandemic, demand for flu shots rose by more than 20% compared to the year before.
We saw a rather large second bounce that we feel is probably predicting what we're going to see this second wave.
Naiman warns with the demand she's seeing now, the province's rollout is already falling short.
And if this is what we're going to have to do for the future, for when the coronavirus vaccine comes, the government really has to figure out how they can do their distribution better. Thank you.
Lauren Pelly, CBC News, Toronto.
The Ontario government is revoking a policy that made seniority the top factor in hiring for teaching posts.
One of the consistent refrains I hear from principals and school boards over the past weeks is that this regulation, more than it ever did, is impeding the ability to swiftly hire, period.
Education Minister Stephen Lecce says the policy is being revoked immediately because it's delaying school boards from hiring teaching staff during the pandemic. Currently, when school boards post a new teaching job, they have to choose among supply teachers with the most seniority. The policy was brought in under the former Liberal government. Lecce says the seniority rule is putting constraints on boards.
Teacher hiring in Ontario will now be dictated by merit, diversity, and the unique needs of schools and communities within our province over seniority. This is about giving school principals more flexibility to hire the very best teaching staff to serve their students day in and day out.
The union representing elementary teachers says the government is using the pandemic as a smokescreen to undermine what it says was a fair and transparent hiring process. Owners of dance studios are pressuring the province to allow them to open, saying they're not the same as gyms. It's one of several frustrations business owners are feeling over the recent restrictions added in Ontario COVID-19 hotspots. Lorenda Redekop has more on the controversy and the confusion.
6 and 5, 6, ready, go!
These days, dance studio owners are stomping mad. Even distanced in masks, classes like this aren't allowed anymore.
6, 7, go!
The studio's owner is also a mother to 3 boys.
My boys are still actively training in hockey. They're actively training in football, but a predominantly female industry based sport or activity, and we're not allowed to be in here.
She worked with the recently formed Dance Safe Ontario to follow the guidelines, added markers on the floor, and sanitized between each class.
I do think it's unfair. I think we're being unfairly grouped together with fitness clubs, with adult-centric fitness and exercise classes.
She's one of thousands of people who signed an online petition to the Premier.
I can tell all the dance studios, I'm onto it, I will ask, I will drill down for you, because I think it's important, but at the end of the day, I still have to listen to docs, but there has to be a balance here.
This jiu-jitsu studio has remained open with smaller classes and says it can under the rules. It's a private sports club governed by a provincial sports organization that consulted with the province. Earlier in the pandemic, the club even had a case of COVID-19.
We had somebody come in who was actually infectious because later that day they had contact with other people outside the academy and did infect them. But in our case, no infections occurred, in part because we stay so socially distanced.
But according to the city, the club is misreading the guidelines. The city emailed a response to CBC. It names 2 regulations that allow martial arts instruction, but then says the ability to open as a provincial sports organization is from a previous version of Stage 2 regulations, so not allowed.
We might get future clarification that might cause us to have to shut down. If that's what the City of Toronto Public Health is doing, I think they're doing a real disservice to the community.
Maureen Morkill says in her community, some dance studios have already been forced to close. She worries without support or a change to the rules, more will follow. Lorenda Redekop, CBC News, Toronto.
There's a new traffic enforcement unit on Toronto's streets, part of the city's plan to eliminate traffic-related deaths and injuries. We'll have the details coming up. Toronto police unveiled a new permanent enforcement team today. Their main focus will be reducing the number of serious and fatal collisions on Toronto streets. It's the city's next step in their Vision Zero plan. Greg Ross has the details.
Motorists who choose to drive in an unsafe manner are much more likely to get tickets. Be aware.
A warning from the chief of police, who in a matter of days will deploy his brand new traffic enforcement team.
The permanent team will be made up of 16 experienced traffic officers and 2 sergeants, split into 2 groups covering morning and evening.
Chief James Raymer says the primary goal for this new task force will be to catch and punish drivers not following the rules of the road, particularly those who drive too fast.
While we will always continue to educate where possible, enforcement is a priority, especially when we know that excess speed is a leading cause in most of our fatal collisions.
They'll patrol the city in marked and unmarked police cars, focusing on areas strategically selected using data collected by the city's Vision Zero plan over the course of the last 3 years.
The data that we're going to provide to the police will show where the best places are for them to apply their efforts as they see fit, but at least it will give them the indication of where speed enforcement is most needed.
People who walk and cycle in some of these areas say it's about time.
I think the lack of enforcement has been a problem over the years because everyone thinks they can just sort of get away with it.
It's long overdue. I've always been scared to bike in this city, so the traffic is it's very bike. Not really bike friendly. In theory, I think that would be great. It's super unsafe to ride almost everywhere in the city, except for I guess up on Bloor now.
The mayor says it was always the plan to form a task force to crack down on aggressive driving, but he says they ran into a number of unexpected obstacles from higher levels of government.
You know, from a fairly straightforward request made to the premier to the day when we're going to deploy them, which is still a week or so away, took years. And it is just part of what I believe to be the archaic system we're operating within, where we have to go and get 9 different sets of permissions.
The mayor says in addition to the task force, the city is also implementing a number of other changes as part of Vision Zero, including reducing speed limits on about 250 kilometers worth of roadways around the city. They're going to add an additional 80 school zones in Toronto, and they're also putting up a number of new crosswalks in some of those problem areas in hopes of making it easier for pedestrians to get across the street. Greg Ross, CBC News, Toronto.
Mainly cloudy tonight with a chance those showers will start back up again and a crisp fall breeze. Colette Kennedy joins us now with a look at the forecast, and it felt like one of the wetter days we've had recently.
Thanks, Talia. Well, after a soggy day, and I know there's areas where it hasn't stopped, but after seeing a soggy day, we are seeing areas where we're getting into a clearing trend and allowing for frost development. So we do have frost advisory tonight, Sarnia-Lambton area. It doesn't mean there aren't other areas where frost is developing because of the cold air, but what happens is once you've had a hard freeze or areas where you've been repeatedly seeing the frost, we stop seeing the advisories go up. So where you're still just getting kind of used to it, yeah, there could be some crop damage, so just wanting you to know in that area there for Sarnia-Lambton. I'm showing you the daytime temperatures. I'm stopping this with the temperature progression this morning. I just want to show you at 7 a.m. how, yeah, it was early this morning in many cases where we actually reached our highs for the day because of that southwesterly flow ahead of that frontal boundary. So St. Catharines was at 20 degrees. We had some high teens that showed up and at least some mid-teens. And then the temperatures as the rain moved in began to fall, and certainly those winds were kicking up as well. So that rain, at least the main line with the front pushing through, now moving to the south of the lower Great Lakes. I know, yes, there are areas especially getting some of this activity that we're seeing that's kind of lake effect with the rain that we're seeing into cottage country. So in the lee of Lake Huron and Georgian Bay, you're really going to have this activity kind of off and on hanging in there. It will adjust a little bit as our winds adjust. So as we see them changing, then you'll see other areas where you've been dry. That's going to be moving into your area as they move a little more towards the west here in terms of the winds. That's going to shift some of these rain showers. I do want you to take note, we're likely going to start off with quite a bit of cloud cover around the Golden Horseshoe. As we get into the late afternoon is our best chance at getting into the clearing and more sunshine, but we're going to have to really wait for it. And until then, some scattered showers are possible. Not many areas will see the wet weather, but it's the kind of thing I don't want you to be caught off guard. I'm going to have my umbrella with me just in case. Then looking ahead as we go through Friday night and getting into Saturday, things are looking better, but again, still some lake effects showing up as the winds turn more southwesterly, where you'll see those adjust once again. And then it is late Saturday. We see the cloud cover poking in. That's the setup for Sunday. The next system moving in, cloud cover, and yes, a chance of showers for the second half of the weekend. So some patchy frost overnight tonight. You can believe it with temperatures looking like this. Tomorrow afternoon, certainly cooler air moves in. It affects those daytime highs as well. Tonight, around the GTA, not as bad, or at least not as cool, I should say, with some of those overnight lows, but daytime highs running below seasonal, closer to 14 degrees. But we get back there, we climb back up for Saturday and Sunday, closer to seasonal, but you can see the cloud cover comes back in. there you are, Sunday into Monday, and there'll be a chance for some showers in there as well. Talia.
Thanks, Colette.
The weather is brought to you by Trane, the most reliable heating and cooling brand. We test, so it runs. It's hard to stop a train.
I'm Ismaila Alpha, host of Metro Morning. Well, after Donald Trump was elected president in 2016, we heard from Americans who were inquiring about moving to Canada. They were thinking about it. Well, on tomorrow's program, we're going to hear from a man who did it. We're going to discuss what life has been like for him in Canada and, well, what it's like to vote from abroad. Join me weekdays 5:30 till 8:30 for Metro Morning on CBC Radio 1.
The Toronto Raptors will have a new look on the court. The team has revealed 3 of their 5 new jersey designs ahead of the upcoming season. According to the NBA club, the jerseys showcase simple but bold design and nod to previous uniforms and the franchise's origins. 2 of the jerseys are white and red and feature a chevron across the chest. The 3rd jersey is black with red accents and pays homage to the Raptors' original dinosaur uniforms. Stylish and symbolic. And that's our show for you tonight. Thanks so much for watching. Dwight Drummond has your next local newscast tomorrow at 6, and I'll see you back here tomorrow night at 11. Good night.